All right, so this is a recording of lecture 11 where we created an address book application. Now, I hope by now you have created the user interface of the address book, which we have done in the class preceding this. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start directly with the JavaScript file. So, start by making a new file, and let's put this in the scripts folder. Call it address book.js, and the usual window dot onload function. Now, if you look at the HTML of the address book, what we have is a button called quick add. When you click on the quick add, it should display the quick add form panel, and then we have a number of input fields like full name, phone, address, city, email, and then we have a button called add. So when we click the button called add, then it should update the address book. So let's start the entire application by first creating some variables for our buttons. So I'm just going to put a remark here. I'm just going to put a comment here called buttons. So the first is the quick add button. So let's call the quick add button, and let's just say document.get element by ID, and the ID for this is, I believe, quick add. Okay, let's just verify this once. Yeah, so that's the ID for the button. Next we have the add button, which you'll see on the form. So document.get element by ID, and we'll say add. That's the ID for the add button. Then we have the cancel button, and it's called cancel. Then we have the div, which holds the form, the div which you need to display and hide based on the button that is pressed. So bring that in. We'll call this quick add form div, and I'll just use the query selector option because in this case it's a class, so this would be a little faster. Quick add form. You could also do something like document.get elements by class name, and inside say quick add form, and then append 0 as square brackets, because the get elements by class name returns an array, and we need the first item of the array because there's only one div with the class name quick add form. So that's the alternative. Next, what we want to do is while we are bringing elements into the script, let's also bring in the form fields. So the first one is called full name, and just go back to the address book. You can see that each input field has an ID, and all of them, they also have a class name. So the class name is something which we will use later, but for now we have the IDs. So the phone field, then we have address, we have city, and we have email. There. Then let's bring in the div, this one. This is where we will be looping over the entries of our address book. This is where you'll see the contents of your address book. So let's bring this in. We'll call this as address book display, just so that it's easily distinguishable. So once you've got all the elements in, the next thing that we have to do is we have to create an array which will hold all the JSON objects for all the entries of the address book. So call this address book and just initialize it like so. Okay, so this is an empty array, and this is what we will populate by means of the local storage. Then we will create our event listeners. So the first thing is the quick add button, and the quick add button is what you see here. So when I click on this, it should display the form panel that we have, and to do that we'll say quick add button dot add event listener click function, and we'll say quick add form div dot style dot display is equal to block. Okay, so let's just try this out. So I'm going to refresh this, and we'll click on the add button, and you can see that the form div is now visible. Now the opposite should happen when we press the cancel button, that you see over here. So let's say cancel button dot add event listener click, and what we should do now is we should do a quick form quick add form div dot style dot display is none. Okay, so what we have built so far is, let's just refresh and check. When you click on the add button, you get this. When you click on the cancel button, it hides the form back. So for now, this is the base functionality that we have built. Next, what we want to do is we want to get into the core logic of the application, where when you fill up the form and you press the add button, this add button, add now, it should insert the contents of the form into a JSON object and should populate the array, ultimately store it in the local storage. So let's first create the event listener. So that will be for the add button. And we want to invoke a function called add to book. Okay, so let's start by writing this function, and what we will do is we'll say function add to book. Now the first thing that you should do in this kind of an application is perform some kind of a basic validation to check whether people have actually filled up the form or not. So in practical applications, you can build complicated form validators which actually check for the phone number in the right format or the email in the right format. But for this particular application, we're just going to put a simple check which says that if the form fields are empty, then do not submit the form, and only if all the form fields have been filled up should the form be submitted. So this can be very easily done by first creating an array. Call the array anything that you want. So I'm calling the array is null, and this will be a long string of validation checks. So it starts by saying full name dot value is not equal to an empty string, and phone dot value is not equal to an empty string. So what we are doing is we are using a number of comparison operators, and we are trying to check whether the contents of the form have been filled up or not. And the idea of doing it this way is that it makes the entire task much more readable and simple to understand. And let's just see, we have, I think, one more field, email. Now I would just do a console log on this variable called isNull, just to show you what happens. Okay, so let's just refresh this and open up the console. So the idea is that we want to submit the form only when all these fields have been filled up. So right now everything is empty. If I click on the add now button, you'll see that the output of the variable called isNull is false. So we want to be able to submit the form only and only when this turns true. Now let's see how this will turn true. So I'll fill up something here, then we'll fill up something here, then we fill up something here, then something goes here. Still you'll see that it says false, but the moment you fill up the last field, you'll notice that now it says true. So the idea is that the moment all fields are filled up, the value of the isNull variable becomes true, and that is when we want to submit the form. So that's the purpose of creating this this simple validator. And all it does is it says it's a long if statement which says if the if full name dot value is not equal to an empty string, and if phone dot value is not equal to an empty string, and if address dot value is not equal to an empty string, and it keeps on going till it checks all the values. And as a result, what happens is if everything is fine, then it will just return a true, or if any one of these does not check up, then it becomes false. So once you have this, then create a simple if validator. So if isNull, and this is where we want to add the contents of the form to the array and local storage. Now the other important thing to understand is that how exactly does a JSON object look like. So in this case, if I were to create a JSON object, it would look something like this. It would look, first you'll have name, and in this case it's called full name. So let's say I filled up the form and it should return something like this. Then you have phone, and it should give me some kind of a number, whatever it is. Then it has address, and it should have something like this. Then it has city, and finally it has email. So you can see that only and only when we have the entire structure created like this can I call this a valid JSON object. So our task is to be able to create this JSON object so that it can be stored into the array and displayed on the page. So the way you can create this entire string easily is by a method known as a constructor function. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function called JSON structure. You can again call this anything, and what this accepts is are all the variables. So full name, phone, address, city, email. So whatever you want to store into your JSON object, you're going to pass all those values into the function. And all we do here is we say this dot full name is equal to full name, and we follow this by saying this dot phone is equal to phone, this dot address equal to address, and this dot city equal to city, and finally this dot email is equal to email. So the idea is, in object oriented programming, the term this refers to all the variables that you can create inside this function, and they are specific to the scope of this function, which is the area inside of the function. Now this is a concept which you'll understand better when we get into the object oriented parts of the language, but for now the idea is all functions in JavaScript are objects. So if you create this variables inside of a function, what you get in return is a JSON object. So we are going to use this as an example, and all I have to do is I have to construct this function. So how do I construct? You construct a function object by using the new operator. So when we do a new JSON structure, and all I have to do is I have to pass in the values. So full name dot value, phone dot value. Now remember, full name, phone, all these we have already used them here also. They were brought in earlier, so these are these variables, and they refer to all the form fields that we have. So you just have to pass these values in, phone dot value, then you have address dot value, then you have city dot value, and then you finally have email dot value. So by just this one single line, what will happen is JavaScript will construct a new function object out of the function that we declared earlier. Okay, and this constructor notation will return back a valid JSON object which we can very easily then push into our array. So this is the easiest way to construct a JSON array. You just have to create one base function which has constructor variables. These are called constructor variables, and they should refer to whatever is coming in via the arguments. Okay, so there is no return here. You don't require a return, because when a function is created in JavaScript, it will automatically initialize as an object and will return you the JSON object also. So this obj variable now contains a valid JSON object constructed out of whatever we have filled up in the form on the page. So once this happens, then all we need to do is we need to go into our address book array, and you know how to push things into an array by using the dot push and push the obj, and this will update the array. Now once this array is updated, what we'll do is we'll push this array into the local storage by writing it like this, local storage, and inside the local storage we will create a key called add book. Okay, so this is the variable, if you may, which will store the value of the array. Now another important thing to note is that local storage is like a database built into your browser. So even if you close the page and if you reload the page, the contents of the local storage would always be there. We had used this system earlier when we did the to do example, so you can go back to that example again and see. But the core idea here is that the local storage can only store strings, and what we have here is an array of JSON objects, which is a specific type of a JavaScript storage structure. So what we can do is to convert this array into a valid string. What we will do is we will use JSON.stringify, and inside this we'll just type in the variable of the array. So this array will be converted into a string and will be stored inside of the local storage. And once this is done, what you need to do is you need to do a couple of things. You need to hide the form panel. So we do that by saying quick add form div dot style dot display equal to none. Then what we want to do is we want two other things. We want to clear the form, because the next time you press the add button, you must have the form empty. Otherwise I'll show you what happens. And then we want some way of updating and displaying all records in the address book. So we have not created our function which will actually show the contents. We have just built a base add function so far. So now let me show you what happens. Just refresh this, fill this up with something, whatever it is. Click on add now, and the current behavior is fine. You don't see the contents of the address book yet because we have not written any function for that yet. Now when I click on the add button again, you'll see that those whatever we had filled up is still there, right? So we need a function which clears out this form. So let's write that function. All right, so let's write a function called clear form, and the idea is the moment you run this, it should clear out all the text fields of the form. And you remember that if you look at the HTML of the form, we had given a class called form fields. So this is now is the time to use these form fields. And the way this will work is we'll create a variable called frm or anything that you want to call it. We'll say document dot query selector all, and I'm going to call this by form fields, and we just do a simple loop. So we'll say for var I in frm. This will now access all the text fields of the form, and we'll just say form square bracket I dot value is equal to an empty string. So this simple function will clear out the form for you in one single go. So all you have to do is once you've done the adding to the local storage, all you have to do is just call this function, and this will clear out the form for you. So let's just test this out. Refresh. Now I'll just type anything in, click on add now, and when I click on the add button again, you'll see that the form fields are empty. Okay, so this little function can save you a lot of headache when it comes to clearing out the entire form. And now we come to the most important part of this this app, where we display the contents of the address book. So let's write a function called show address book, because ultimately what is the fun of adding something to the local storage if you're not going to show it? Now here's the simple logic that we will employ while creating this function. First, check if the key add book exists in local storage, because remember, when you open the page, this is the function that will be run on the very first run of the page. So if this key does not exist in local storage, we would want to create this, and so check if the key address book exists in local storage, or else create it. If it exists, load contents from the local storage and loop display it on the page. Okay, so that's how simple it gets. So let's see. I will say if local storage S capital with a key name called add book is equal to undefined. Okay, so JavaScript will return undefined if this particular key does not exist in your browser's local storage. So this is a way of checking whether it exists or not, because remember, when you open this page, we will run this function for the very first time, and if the local storage key does not exist, then it will throw an error. So what we want to do is, if it does not exist, if it is set to undefined, then we would want to create something here. So we'll say local storage add book is equal to, and open a string and store an empty array. So the idea is that since there is nothing inside the address book, we would want to initialize it like this, because keep in mind, local storage can only store strings. It cannot store arrays as structures. So if you do it like this, you're in fact storing an empty array as a string. If the local storage key address book is add book is there, if it's available, then what you need to do is you need to update your array, the array which we created in the beginning. Remember, when we open the app for the first time, it is initialized to an empty array. So what we want to do is, if the address book, if the local storage does contain something, then we would want to update this empty array with the contents of the local storage. So we do that by saying address book. Now the array containing the JSON objects that we have stored in the local storage, it is stored as a string. Okay, so you need to convert that string into an array of valid JSON objects, which you can then read and process. and that is made possible by saying json.parse. Parse is a way of saying process. Okay, go line by line and process. And what do we want to process? We want to process the contents of local storage add book. Okay, so this will load the contents from the local storage and will convert it into a valid JavaScript array of JSON objects. So that's the whole idea. And once you have this, then the first thing you do is you empty out your add book div, which is basically this particular div, because this is where we're going to display the address book. So we'll just empty this out, because we're going to insert the contents from the local storage. And then we'll say for var n in address book, that's the array, and this is where you're going to construct a string out of your JSON objects. So for this, what we'll do is, I already have this commented out. This is one single entry which we designed, so I'm just going to copy this. This is what will be looped. So your JavaScript is supposed to loop this loop over the contents of the local storage and create these individual entries into the DOM. Okay, so let's just copy this entire block, bring this into JavaScript, and what we need to do is we need to first start a variable called str, or you can probably name it anything. Just keep in mind that it has to be a single quotes, because you're already using double quotes in the HTML. And then keep constructing this. So append, this plus is equal to means append. Now what we're going to append here, we're going to append address book square bracket n, because remember it's an array of JSON objects, so we have to loop over all the items in that array, and each item is a valid JSON object. So once you get access to that item, we'll say dot full name to access the value by key. Then close this. So we are concatenating. Then we want the email, which is stored in the JSON object. And finally we have the delete button. Now in the delete button, what I want to do is I want to be able to actually first I'll create a class called del button. We're going to use this, and then we want a data ID, because I want to be able to delete individual entries. So we'll start this like so, plus, and we'll just append in the data ID, we will put the index number of the item, okay, which can be accessed by the variable n in this case. And this would make the delete button usable. Finally, we'll say add book div dot inner HTML, append the entire thing that we have created in the string. And once this entire function is over, you just need to run this the very first time. So when I refresh this page, what it does is it will show me the contents of the local storage, which you can actually go into the resources, and you can go into the local storage, and you can go into the file, and you'll notice that we have a key called add book with the contents that we stored earlier. And you click on add, so it'll fill up like this, and we click on the add now button, and what it should do is it should show up this thing. Now remember that we made this add function, but what we are doing is we are not calling the show address book function yet. So you need to put the show address book function in the add book, so that once you push the new contents into the local storage, you need to update the display also. So that update display can be accessed by, can be forced by doing the show address book function, by running this function once you've added everything into the local storage. Okay. Now so far we've got the base functionality working. So if you were to add some value, you'll notice that when I click on the add button, it updates the list also, and it is showing me. And even if I reload, or if I close the page and open this again, all these entries would still show because they have been stored in the browser's internal storage. Now we need the last thing in this application is to make these buttons work. So the way we will do this is, if you look at the contents of the address book, the way we will make these buttons work is that we will attach an event listener to this div. And we have done this before. The idea is that we will monitor for all clicks inside of this div. This is where we see all the entries. And when somebody clicks on the delete button, when you find the class name del button being pressed, only then you should proceed with deleting the entry. So let's see how this is done. First of all, go all the way up to the event listeners, and the reason why we are adding the event listener to the div and not to the individual delete buttons is because, let's say you have 1,000 entries in the address book, you don't want 1,000 event listeners to be added into your script. Okay, that will make the program highly inefficient. And besides, every time that you add something, you'll have to create a new event listener. So we use a process called bubbling, where the idea is that inside of this div, inside of this DOM element, if somebody clicks, then I can check for that particular click, and I can actually find out where the person is clicking. So if the person is clicking on this button, then do something, or else don't do anything. So this makes it very convenient, and you just have to use one single event listener, and it makes the entire application far more efficient. So we'll say addbook div dot add event listener, and we'll say remove entry. So let's write this function called remove entry, and this function will be used for removing the entries from the address book. So we'll say function remove entry and I'm going to pass in the EVT object, because you can call this E. Actually, let's call this E, makes things simple. And the idea is that the event listener gives you a set of data inside a property called E, and we have seen this before. I've shown this before in the class also. And what we need to do is we need to check where the person is clicking inside that address book div. So for that purpose, you have to use this. When the person clicks anywhere inside the add book div, the event listener will pass this data into the remove entry function via this argument called E. So all we have to do is we have to check if e dot target, that is where exactly is the person clicking inside that div, check in the class list by using the contains option, check for something called del button. Because remember, if we look at the individual entries, every delete button has a class called del button. Okay, so we want to be able to find that out if the person is clicking on this link, and if so, get the index id. So we'll use a variable called rem id, and this is the value of the data id attribute. This is simply the index number of the entry. So if I'm clicking on, for instance, if I'm clicking on the last one, that will be 0, 1 and 2. So if you right click here and if you go into inspect element, you'll notice that this link has a class called del button and has a data id set to 2. Okay, so this is what we want, this is what we want to read in. So we'll say rem id is equal to e dot target dot get attribute data dash id, and finally we want to remove the JSON entry from the array with the index number is equal to rem id. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll say address book dot splice, and this is something which you've done before, and we want to remove exactly one entry. And once we've done that, we need to put that back in the local storage because now the contents of the array have changed. So local storage is equal to local storage add book is equal to JSON dot stringify, because remember you have to store only strings, and we'll put the entire array. So this JSON dot stringify will convert the contents of the array, the updated contents of the array after the removal, into a string, and will store it inside the local storage. And once you've done that, just update the display by running the show address book function. So just one thing I would like to point out, that the e.target.classlist.contains, the last time we did something like this, we did .classname.match. .classname.match is typically available across all browsers, whereas this is ECMAScript 5, and in certain older browsers this might not work. However, all modern browsers support it. So this is the alternative method of finding out that if the class attribute of an element contains a particular class name. In this case, we are checking for del button. So let's see if this works. Refresh, and let's say I'll remove this first entry. Click on the delete button, the thing goes. Click on this thing, this goes again. So that's how the address book is built up. Okay, please watch this video again and again in case you need clarification. Just we'll solve those problems in the class. Thank you.